Professor Hazel Ramos from Nottingham University, Malaysia. It's fantastic to have you back, and it's fantastic to have you here talking about the idea and the skills, I guess, of gearing up for your annual review when it comes to your doctorate review. And tonight's approach is very much a fireside chat. I have a long list of questions for you, and I'm taking the questions from a couple of different perspectives. First, I'm taking it from your perspective as a supervisor and how you go about helping your research candidates to cope with and, of course, to prepare for their annual review. And secondly, I want to flip that narrative and talk about it from the research candidate's perspective. Not so much how do they make the process go through, but how do they learn and develop and extract important ideas to empower them as they move forward? How do they take the feedback and get some benefit for it? So I'm going to start off with yourself and your personal approach to um, preparing candidates for a review. And I know you've done many, many, many over the years. That's why you're here, of course. But I'm curious what your personal approach to preparing candidates for their annual review is. And how does that differ based on the needs of candidates?
Okay, thanks, Craig. Thanks for the invite. And I'm really glad to be here again this evening and to be able to share some of my, I guess, experiences as a supervisor and in terms of preparing for the annual review. When I look at the annual review, I would look at it across the year. So let's start off with the first annual review, which is usually the most, I guess, nerve-wracking for most candidates, primarily because for many candidates, it's also their confirmation review. It tells them whether they are suitable to pursue, the PGR studies or the postgraduate research studies into their second and third or fourth years, right? So I would say that preparing for your first annual review as a supervisor is a lot of my approach to it is more about confidence building, getting the student to be comfortable, for instance, in speaking to another person who is not their supervisor. So I usually frame it as this is your chance to ask someone about their opinion and give you feedback without actually getting either a fail or a pass mark for it, right? And building their confidence so that they could speak about their project, what their plans are, and what they have done in the past 12 months of their annual review. And that differs a lot across candidates because we do have students who are more confident as compared to others, whereas there are some that are so nervous. I once had a student who was almost ready to cry because they were concerned that the timings of their PowerPoint slides were not in sync, with the what they wanted to say. And they worry a lot about those things. So as a supervisor, you're kind of like the coach, the mentor that kind of tells them that, it's okay. So what is, and making clear to them what is the goal of the annual review. And I think that's something that we all have to prepare for as a supervisor, explaining to our students, what is the point of an annual review? What is the goal that you want to achieve at the end of this? And then getting them prepared for that.
Is I mean, you make a really good statement there. The poor candidate who's, worried about their timing. I felt like that in my early days of teaching. Um, and
Right.
yeah, I never got it right. But at the end of the day, is this a conversation or is this a presentation? Because if I'm so concerned about my slides being spot on and me having that second to second matching. I feel like I'm more in a 3-minute thesis competition, or I feel like I'm in a very time constrained conference presentation. So, how would you advise? I mean, I know it's a mix of both, but how would you go about
I
advising and helping them to prepare for that?
Yeah, so like I normally tell my students that there is a formal part of your annual review, and there is the more important informal conversation part. So the formal part is like, the things that we have to do to get it done as per regulation. You have to write a report. You have to do a 15-20 minute presentation in a PowerPoint, right? And you have to produce records of your supervision and your training. So I call them it's like the vegetables, you have to eat them, right? So,
Yeah.
but
Okay.
the bigger chunk of that where you will gain insights is having that conversation later on, having to, either answer questions or ask questions. I think that's the I call it the fun but sometimes scary part, because you do have to speak to another person, that, this is my study, right? So sometimes I ask them to practice with their friends. The only downside of that is sometimes your friends know your research so much, so, especially if they're in the same field. So I do encourage my student to talk to someone who's like totally from a different program. So like if there is like psychology, talk to someone who's in engineering or, in pharmacy. If they can understand what you're talking about in your simplest language, then likely a stranger will understand what you're saying as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because everybody who's so close to you is going to be, oh, that's wonderful, Hazel, you've done a great job, versus being able to say, hey, I didn't get this, I didn't
Yeah.
understand this.
And
So
as a
so that's valuable.
supervisor as well, sometimes you miss out on things because you're so enmeshed in that project anyway.
Yeah,
So it would be good to have like a different pair of eyes to kind of
yeah.
look at your work as well.
No, that's cool. Let's move on to setting expectations. And so, what sort of strategies do you employ to ensure that candidates understand the criterion by which they're going to be evaluated during their review, especially since you talk about the formal part and then you talk about the more valuable informal part, but that's obviously where a lot of the feedback candidates get is going to be of value to them. So how do we set expectations? How do we communicate the criterion for
So
candidates?
I think it goes back to the regulations that you might have in your university. So, as supervisors, you need to be able to explain to your students that these are the expectations of PhD students in our university. What are the kind of research questions that are expected at this? Let's say in your first annual review or your second annual review, what are the expected outputs that you might have? And that's something that you have to discuss even at the start of the project. From the very first supervision meeting that you have, you need to start building that expectation so it doesn't come out as a surprise to the student. So, and it also doesn't look as daunting.
Yeah.
So, from day one, you tell them there is a review, right? And we do need to show progress as, explain what these formal bits for. So, for instance, I would explain to my students the reason why we ask you to, pull out records of your supervision meetings with us is to protect yourself, protect your supervisors, and give an external record of what we agreed upon every time we meet. Because memories are not the best for all. So there is a purpose for all these formalities that we are doing, and even the review itself has a main purpose because your reviewer would like to know where you are and how do you move your research forward, right?
Okay, now that's cool. Just as a sort of a sidebar, and this is not one of the questions I preempted you on. How are you a fan of the concept or the notion of a supervision contract? Something that, I mean, that emerged out of the university that I came from,
Mm.
by one of my mentors, actually. But having a sort of a contract which sets those expectations, because you did talk about, right from the beginning, you're going to have this, this is going to happen. So do you have any thoughts on that just at this juncture?
Whereas you actually, whether you need it as a formal document, I'm probably not the biggest fan of formal documentation because it's one more paperwork for me to keep. But I can understand the importance of building that good relationship. And in some ways, there's some form of a psychological contract between the supervisor and the student in terms of what is their expectations of each other. And I think whether it's a written form of contract or something that is just verbalized, it's built on a system of trust,
Yeah.
right? Your students will trust that you will give them the fairest, supervision. You will not kind of coddle them and just keep saying it's good. So, and for instance, for my students, I make that clear from the start. Like when I am criticizing your work, I'm not out to find fault in you, but I'm just doing my responsibility as your supervisor so that when it comes to your review or your viva later on, you know that I prepped you well enough to anticipate some of the questions that another person might be asking. And I guess that contract there is that trust building exercise that you might have. So, and for the supervisor, it also tells them how committed the student is. Is
Yeah.
this something that they really want to pursue, or it's just something that was imposed upon them by somebody else, right?
Now, I've known you for a few years, and I know that you're a very supportive supervisor. That doesn't
Thank
always
you.
exist out there. I'm working with somebody at the moment whose supervisor, or actually two people whose supervisors are ignoring their communication. So it of course makes added hurdles for them.
I
But
mean, I had my own supervisor. I would remember Craig is like, they're supportive. Both my master's and my PhD supervisors were supportive, but they also, I guess, trusted me enough to know that I can do it. So I remember for my master's thesis, my supervisor and I had only one supervision meeting, and he had
that
one
sounds
sentence
familiar.
of an advice to me. He said, "Just do it." We met 10 weeks later during my proposal and final viva. That's it. But I think he knew me well enough that he knew that I can work independently. And then I wanted to work independently.
Yeah.
But he knew as well that if I wasn't understanding, I would go up and ask the question. Right. So I think it's that implicit trust that we had with each other.
That's always good. I mean, actually thinking about my own masters, I met my supervisor, I think twice in a year, and he was a lovely guy. I think in two meetings we once spoke about my research. That was it. It was very, very brief. But yeah, let's move on to something that's actually really important from the candidate perspective. As a candidate, I'm going into a review meeting. What type of feedback should I be seeking from that meeting? Not just I'm going to prepare my presentation and all of that. What should I be asking for? What should I be making sure that when I walk out of the door, I have I'm not sure if confidence is the right word, but I have a sort of a set of important points addressed so that I can strategize, especially if I'm like we've just both talked about, quite happy to be quite independent. But of course, independent people still need quality feedback. So what
Yes.
sort of feedback should I be making sure I leave the room with?
I think it's a balance between what have I done well and what are the areas I can improve upon. We do tend to focus on the second more, what are the areas that I'm bad at or I need improvement. But you also need to know as a student, what were actually the good points that you had, in your thesis, so that it gives you where am I doing well and where should I actually get more, do some more work. I think a core question that students should also ask is that anything that's puzzling them about their research. It's like the strategy that we have as teachers when we are in class and we don't know how to answer a student's question, and we just say, can you tell me what do you think about it? Like you bring back so why not take advantage of your reviewer and ask them the question that you are also asking yourself, how do I answer it? Because the reviewer is someone who has some level of expertise in that field. So why not take advantage of that expertise and feed, what you call this, pick their brains for it,
Yeah.
right? So, and I think it's important that you come prepared with questions. So not just anticipate what they might ask you, but what kind of questions do I would I like to ask them? Even if it's just something as mundane as do you think my data collection approach is appropriate? Is my sample size good enough? You might think of it as a very mundane question, but it actually might start off conversations that would actually benefit you in the long run.
Okay. So you and I are both quite ballsy people, and I'll use a nice colloquialism there. Not everybody has that confidence to ask questions. So is sort of taking a mundane type question a good way to start building up those communication skills, those strengths, just to get that conversation going?
Yeah, I think it's, asking questions, even learning to ask questions to other PhD students. So
Okay.
sometimes it might be helpful that, you get to attend another student's Viva, for instance, and you get
Right.
to experience what they have, attending conferences, symposiums. That also builds up your confidence in asking questions. As a reviewer myself, I do take note that many of the students would be quite scared. So I take a more kind of constructive approach and I try to really see it from their point of view. But that's me as a reviewer.
Yeah.
So I try to, even if I don't like, let's say, the general direction of the thesis that I am reading at the moment, I will try and find something nice about it, right? And try to kind of push the conversations towards how I would like the direction to be without sounding highly critical. Because as a reviewer, I see it as my responsibility as well to help the candidate move their research to the next stage. And I won't be able to accomplish that if I'm just telling them what's wrong, what's wrong, what's wrong all the time.
Yeah. Okay. So what about candidates talking to people prior to the review? Say next week, Hazel, you and I have a review session. I'm going to be presenting my research. But what would you encourage me to come to you, say, a week or two before and say, I got a couple of questions that I want to think about for the formal process next week. What's your thoughts on
I
that?
think it's highly helpful. In some institutions, we do allow multiple review sessions. You have the formal bit, but you also have the informal bit. Back in the days in our program in Nottingham, for instance, we didn't really have, in the early part of our program, we didn't really have a formal presentation part of the annual review. And I actually appreciated that process more. What we had were like kind of like a developmental conversation. What are my goals and where have I gone in the
Yeah,
past 12 months? So it was more of like, let's review what you have done in the last 12 months and let's have a conversation together. And we often often had that conversation over, 2 days, 3 days, depends on how much time you might have. And I thought that was really helpful because it does force the candidate to reflect a bit more.
Okay.
Uh, but I can understand that it's also time consuming, especially when there are a lot of students to get through. When you have just one or two students, it's okay. But when you
Back
get,
in the good old days.
yes, but when you have like 8, 10 or more, you know,
Sure.
and plus the challenge of having no formal structures is that the criteria might not be as clear as well, right? But having those conversations with your reviewer outside the formal processes could actually be helpful as well because they could give you insights that is not necessarily captured during that brief review period that you had together.
Right. What what about if, say, as a candidate, I'm struggling to meet my expectation or your expectations, the university's
Mm.
expectations? I'm struggling to meet milestones. And I'm sort of at the point like I want to delay or I want to try and avoid
Mhm.
having this formal conversation. What sort of type or what type of support can you provide, or what sort of advice can you give to a student who's perhaps, regardless of reason, it could be health, it could be laziness, it could be, family responsibilities, any number of things, right? But what sort of support and advice can you offer to a candidate who's consciously aware that they're not quite up to speed at this point in time?
I guess it's my main advice to them would be try and evaluate what's your goal with these PhDs. Sometimes we tend to put such high expectations ourselves, thinking that the PhD research that you're doing, it's like the the only thing that you'll be doing for the rest of your research career. When in fact, it's just the start of a long academic journey or a long journey in research that you might have, right? And maybe managing those expectations that you put on yourself might help as well in, you may not necessarily be not meeting the expectations. It could be that you set up the expectations too high for yourself. At the same time, it could also be that, is this what you really want to do at this point in time? Taking a break is also something that is perfectly acceptable, right? However, from a supervisor's point of view, I think we also have to be honest enough to and be brave enough to tell our students if they're really not meeting expectations, because it's the worst thing you can do is give them false hopes that they're doing okay, and then when you get to your final viva they end up failing. I'd rather take out the band-aid from day one and say that I'm sorry, it is not working out, right? And maybe we need to rethink the direction of this research.
I I certainly like the idea of taking a break is okay. And I know a few people that I work with who it's worked for them. It's just given them that time to refocus. I know many universities have how do I put it, exit points
Mhm.
that say, for example, I'm 2 years into my doctorate. I'm not in a position to actually finish that, but I can exit with, say, a postgraduate diploma based on the work that I've done. And I think that although it's not ideal for either of the parties, it is still ideal that the work is recognized, and having it as an option is quite good.
So normally, like in Nottingham, we do that at the end of year one in your
Okay.
formation, where there is a decision whether you move on to continue with the PhD or
Yeah.
you go to the MPhil, the master's. So
Right.
the tricky bit though is in Malaysia, the
Yes.
ministry doesn't allow for exit degrees. So
Yeah.
once you've gone to year two, year three, you either get the full PhD or you don't get it at all. So
Yeah.
so that's why that honest conversation of whether are we moving forward or not should be really taken into consideration during your first annual review, so
It
that you can still make up for it and make the logical decision later on.
which I think circles back to it's okay to take a break and
Yes.
reevaluate where you want to go, maybe even reevaluate the scope of the
Yeah.
research into something that's going to be achievable for the candidate. Um, sorry, I'm just looking at I need my glasses to be stronger now. Oh boy, that's bad for me. So let's assume, we've talked a little bit about candidates who haven't quite met or
Mhm.
haven't sort of come to the point. And I really loved your comment that sometimes candidates themselves over expect. And I think that's important because a lot of us suffer from imposter syndrome. A lot of us feel that we should be doing more and actually can be reminded we're doing a decent enough job, we're making the grade,
Yes.
which is important. But what about when we really aren't making that grade? What sort of other successful interventions or strategies can you help to implement with a candidate to bring them back to par, to where they need to be?
I mean, I guess this combination of having, reevaluating the direction of the thesis as a supervisor, identifying what areas, is it a training need? Is it a knowledge need? Right? So if it's a training or skills-based need, what does the university have to offer, for instance? So let's say a student doesn't needs some training on research methods or some software. Do we have that in the university? If not, is there something that we can tap outside, bringing external expertise as well? So sometimes we might bring another supervisor in the field just so to kind of give a different perspective and encouraging the student to really seek out answers outside the supervision team sometimes. If it's more of a knowledge need, directing the students towards, interesting readings, if it's a motivation need, it's about maybe getting them to have conversations with other PhD students who might have struggled before but has experienced better times, and kind of like tell them, this happens. For instance, at any given point in time, a PhD student will want to quit. I think
Yeah,
that's a universal reality we all face, right? And so I tell my students, when you get to that point, do not think that you're the only one who's wanting to quit. Everyone will have that moment. The thing is, take a breather, maybe a few hours or a few days and evaluate again, do it one step at a time. So, and I think meeting other people who has gone through that process is quite helpful to some of the students because they realize, oh, hey, I'm not alone in this journey, you
yeah.
know it's because it can be isolating as well.
I
So,
I think, well, the isolation apart, because the PhD journey or the doctoral journey is certainly very, very lonely for a lot of candidates. And, part of the reason we started the third degree was to actually be there for others. But I think all of us, it doesn't matter whether we're doing our doctorate or whether we're working, we have that I want to quit day. I've said it to myself 10 times today. Um, and I do. I mean, I shouldn't talk to myself negatively, but we have our bad days. We have our times where everything seems overwhelming. Tomorrow I look back and I'll be like, why? It went smoothly, you know?
Yeah,
So,
that's why I think it's important that you choose a topic that you're really interested in.
yeah.
When those bad days come out, it's that's interest that you had, will give you that kind of push. Oh yeah, I'm doing this because I really wanted to learn about this topical area. May not be the most popular topic in the world, may sound weird to some, but I'm interested in it. So so kind of like do what you love, right?
No, exactly. You talked about the having a knowledge gap as being one of the potential problems. So I guess one of the potential solutions is perhaps auditing a master's class in an area that aligns, whether that be in your immediate department or perhaps in another department within the university or even online,
Outside. Yeah.
just to help get some deeper
Yeah.
understanding of what's there.
And it's about like having that, maintaining that curiosity, right? Of knowing that you're never gonna, I guess, learn everything in one go.
Yeah,
But learning to ask questions and be curious, that helps fill that knowledge gap. So, I may not understand what exactly this topic means, but if I'm curious enough, I can go research about it, read some books, read some journal articles, or just have conversations with people who are doing
yeah.
research. Right?
And I think by the time anyone reaches doctoral level, having, say, a conversation or reading an article or sitting into a webinar or a lecture, we absorb and understand so much faster than, say, 5 years previously, where we're trying to think, what is this about and how do we
Yeah,
take it?
and it's something that you're interested in, then you get to access more information as well. But there's also, we acknowledge that access to some information can be limited, especially if you're coming from a university that's smaller or may not necessarily have the resources that bigger universities might have. And I think this is where networks play a big role. Having a community like the third degree, for instance, knowing other people who might be in the same journey. So I tease my students that, whenever you're doing research, especially your thesis, it's like test of friendships. Right. The more friends you have, the more likely you will access information that you need. So I may not have, let's say, an access to a particular journal, but I can ask other people in my network, hey, do you have access to this? Can I borrow it? Right? So,
That's
um,
something that happens a lot on our WhatsApp chat group, actually. I'm looking for an article. Can anybody share it? And, every university is different, access is different. So it's always a nice thing to see. I
yeah.
kind of want to shift the conversation slightly different for a moment to the idea of professional development. A lot of what we've talked about up until this point tonight has been a focus on what do I need to talk about? What feedback do I need? How do I cope? How uh, how appropriate is the annual review as a point in which to say, I also want to start planning for my professional development? Where am I heading? The PhD may be a key to the door, but it may be the job. It may be actually now I'm ready to publish a couple of pieces that are adjacent to my research and so forth. But how appropriate is the annual review discussion or process to actually starting to prepare the a candidate's professional development plan?
I think it's a very important aspect of the annual review. So one of the formal things that we do ask candidates, for instance, in the review is a list of trainings that they might have done, professional development courses that they would have undertaken. But more than that, what is some of the things that they'd like to gain more confidence in or gain more expertise in, right? And part of the review process is evaluating what lies ahead, not just for your research, but for you as a researcher or an academic or your career path. So this is an excellent opportunity for the candidate to seek feedback in terms of, you know, what they see as a career for them in the future. So they might ask the reviewer, apart from being an academic, what else can I do with a PhD, for instance, rather than let the study gather dust somewhere,
No, so
although not electronic. So float in the clouds somewhere maybe. But I think it's also an opportunity to identify areas where the candidate can develop further. I remember one of the reviews I done, I think recently, I actually asked the candidate to do by the end of the next year, so the next review, that she would need to be able to present in any conference at least once. And
nice.
and the reason I asked her to do that was because she was very scared of presenting in front of me, right? And I'm like, I'm not gonna eat you. I'm like, I smile all the time, but I need you to be confident to present your findings. So I told her, I don't care whether it's a conference in the university, outside the university, online, face to face, whatsoever. I just want you to have one opportunity to present. And I remember the next year, the candidate was like, she was so excited to say that she was able to present. And I guess more than the presentation itself is having that kind of push to try something new, right? So as a reviewer, it's something that we can ask our students as well to, try something different, right?
Yeah. I love that, and I kind of that segues nicely into the next part that I want to focus on, which is building resilience. And as you know, even through my involvement at Nottingham with the Brown Bag series, for example, it was about finding ways to help candidates uh, become more resilient as researchers and ultimately become more resilient as people, because we've signed up to 3 years. Some will say we've signed up to 3 years of hell. I think we sign up to 3 years of an amazing experience, but we got to know that it's going to work as well. So how can we use this opportunity as supervisors, as reviewers, to build candidates' resilience? And how should a candidate focus on, maybe focus is the wrong word. How should a candidate consider developing their own resilience? Because each one of them has such unique challenges, fears, imposter syndrome aspects. And, I'm I'm scared to walk across the street to buy ice cream, but I'm happy to stand in front of a stage and talk to 1,000 people. So we're all different, right? How can
Yes.
we how can we inculcate resilience
Yeah.
amongst each other?
So I guess I can answer that in two ways. From a supervisor or reviewer perspective, it's about explaining to your students what's the purpose of the feedback, you know, and explaining that even if I give you criticisms, if I highlight what's wrong with your paper, I'm doing it because of the purpose of I want your work to be better, right? So have it's like when you get punished as a child, we tell parents it's important that they explain to the child why they're being punished, what's the purpose of this. So as a supervisor, you need to also explain these are my criticism because this and so on. As a student, I encourage my student to fail, and I don't mean like don't do anything
Huh?
and just submit nothing, right? But I tell them that sometimes failure is one of the best way to build resilience, because if you can get through that failure, then it makes you stronger. So one, I guess, I always like saying this, try submitting to a journal and get yourself desk rejected and read through the feedback. It is a test of self-efficacy. Because sometimes they give you, sometimes the feedback can be very, threatening. And I explain to my students that look at it as not as a criticism of yourself as a person, but a criticism of the piece of study that you've done. It is not you, it is the paper. To learn to differentiate between yourself as a person and your work in your thesis, for instance. And never be afraid to fail because otherwise, you're never going to try. Um, once upon a time, I failed statistics, and I've openly told that to my classes. Then I tell them that I failed statistics, but here I am teaching you guys statistics now, right? And it was a very humbling experience to fail, but I realized that if I can get through that, I can probably get through a lot of challenges in life as well and see it as that it's not the end point. But obviously, during the time that you get rejected for any paper, we still feel bad, right? So
Yeah.
allow yourself also the process of grieving.
I,
So kind of like let yourself grieve, but maybe not too long, and
I
just kind of move forward.
I have a mentor from many years ago, and 30 plus years ago. And when I last spoke to him a few years ago when I started the third degree and we are talking about stuff, he was a head of school. He was about number four in the hierarchy at Auckland University. He'd been around, 5 decade career. And he said to me, I hate receiving feedback. Not I hate it, I'm scared of receiving feedback. And then he said, if you don't like the webinar I do, just don't tell me. But I think, we have this innate fear of failure. I think for some people that's also cultural because different cultures treat failure in different ways. If I didn't pass at school, I was encouraged to try and do better. If I'm Asian, I'm lucky I get food for a week. So I had a friend tell me that story. Um, but I think, we have to acknowledge that sometimes we will fail. I don't know if you remember earlier this year the news article about the South Korean lady who took her driver's test over 900 times before she got it. She got it. That's all that matters, right?
Yes,
At the
yes.
end of the day, you achieve the goal because we're doing it for ourselves, not always for anybody else. But that kind of segue aside, I touched on cultural, and I would like to move into a question about both um, cultural and institutional factors,
Mhm.
knowing that they're both different, but knowing that there's going to be overlaps as well. So, are there any specific challenges or opportunities that you've been able to observe in supporting doctoral candidates from diverse backgrounds through their annual review? And, I ask this as a white guy from down under to a professor from the Filipino professor who lives in Malaysia. We're all in a context that's different to our own.
Mhm.
How can we, how can we create support opportunities there?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunities in terms of supporting people by just understanding where they're coming from. Sometimes as a reviewer, when you give feedback, for instance, you really need to understand where the candidate's culture is coming from. Are they the kind, of individuals who will be open to receiving feedback? Um, do you need to be very explicit with your words, or do you need to kind of segue a bit? And I think a big factor in that is getting to know the candidate, because your goal is not to destroy their spirit, right? So how you get to that building their confidence, getting them to the next stage. You need to get to know the candidate and how they might receive the feedback. So in my training as a clinical psychologist before, I remember one of my mentors told me that, Hazel, you need to understand that not all people are ready for the truth. And I used to reflect on that and like, yeah, I can be very brutally honest when I want to, but then I realize sometimes the receiver might not be ready. So in doing the reviews as well, in doing an annual review, I have to be mindful of, nonverbal reactions. What is the background of the candidate? Not because I want to make excuses for them, but how do I give them feedback that will be beneficial for them? Right. The same thing goes for the student. Um, it can be helpful to understand where your reviewer is coming from as well, because reviewers do have a pattern, So like a quantitative researcher will tend to focus on your quantitative bits. So if your research is more qualitative, don't worry so much about the quali, right? Anticipate a lot of more questions on the quantitative bit. So it's kind of like understanding your reviewer's passion as well. So it's like doing background checks in some ways, and that helps you anticipate how they might react to your presentations, right? So someone who, let's say your reviewer is an expert in this field, let's say work life balance, right? Obviously you need to do your homework if your research is in work life balance, making sure that you probably may want to cite some of their works, you know kind of. It's almost like preparing for a journal submission as well, right? Understanding your target market, in this case your target reviewer. So I think getting to know each other works both ways.
Okay. Earlier, we talked about the sort of the structure of a review session, and that would typically involve a short presentation, a formal, and then a discussion. So we've spent a lot of time on the discussion. Can we sort of just circle back to the presentation for a few minutes? What should we be putting in a formal presentation? And I'm not talking about having the pretty slides that are timed to my speech, because I know that's never going to happen with me. But what are the key things that I should be highlighting as a candidate? Um, Maybe categories might be
Mhm.
the way to put it, but what should I be making sure I highlight? Um, Even if it's little things that help me to make a difference.
I think having first of all having very clear slides. Don't do that by PowerPoint. Because like what you don't want to do is bombard your reviewer with so much information, right? But like for instance, for your first annual review, it's all about what is the general objective of the thesis. What are your research questions that you'd like to ask? No matter how unrefined they have to be there, because your reviewer would need to understand what's your goal for this thesis, and what's your plan in how to answer those objectives. Quite a simple structure if you think about it. In the second or the third reviews, it's about what happened since the last review, what
Okay.
have I done, and where am I going to next, right? So you don't need to repeat the entire report in the presentation. I think that's a mistake that a lot of students make, is that they tend to make like a long summary of the report, because your reviewer would have read it. But what you want to highlight is what are the key milestones that were achieved from the previous review, and whether you've achieved them or you did not achieve them. And where do you see yourself for the remainder of your candidacy?
If I look at, say, a candidate who's just wrapping up their second year, they've done their data collection, should they be focusing on the data or should they be focusing on what challenges the data has brought for them and what key opportunities that has brought?
Yeah, I think it's the latter that they should focus on. Because data that you have already collected, there's nothing much you can do about that, right? So
No.
it's done. But what are some of the challenges or reflections? What can I do next, right? So it's a question of, am I analyzing it the right way? Is there a new lens that I could put into it? And if you yourself as a candidate have those kind of uncertainties, it's best to put them forward in the review session, right? So I remember when I was doing my PhD, I collected my data. It was qualitative. And during the Viva itself, I was asked why I did not consider a particular context in the data.
Hmm.
And what I remember, I told my panel of reviewers that, oh, it was because you told me not to include that context in our last review. Right? They were all like mesmerized. But I realized that, sometimes questions like this is important. That, maybe during my previous review, I could have asked,
Yeah.
I need to add this context, right? So fortunately for me, I actually collected that context without including it in the primary analysis. So I actually circled back and said, do you want me to include it now in the paper?
Good.
And then they said, oh, no, no, no need, right? So kind of like, but maybe asking the questions of, am I missing something? And that's something that as a candidate, you need to ask those questions. Take advantage of your reviewer's expertise.
So it does become a two-way conversation then, and also seeking advice rather than just seeking feedback.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to move into one final question, which we've kind of touched upon a little bit. But let's just see whether you might want to add some things, and then we'll open it up to the floor for any questions. And I kind of want to just wrap it up on a concept of continual improvement, because obviously it's part of our learning journey. But how can candidates leverage feedback received during their annual review to inform their realigned, perhaps, or adjusted research trajectory, and also their academic journey moving forward?
I mean, I guess the first thing you need to ask yourself is that feedback something doable for me? Is it aligned with my goals? Is it aligned with my values as a researcher? Remember, it's feedback. Unless your reviewer tells you that you explicitly have to do it, otherwise you won't pass, there is a choice whether you'd follow their feedback or not, right? So obviously there's a risk if the feedback is not followed, it might bite you later on. But if you can defend why you decided to go another pathway, then good on you as well, right? Because your reviewer is never going to be perfect. They're asking questions at a snippet in time. And as a researcher, you need to be able to critically evaluate whether that feedback will actually work for your research or not. It's the same thing when you ask feedback about, careers. Your career counselor will only tell you what they've read, what's the trend. Everybody's in AI at the moment, but do you really want to be in AI? Right? So, and you might choose the path less taken, but
Yeah.
it is a choice that the student has, right? Like, so, and whether your choice aligns with the reviewer or not, you just need to be able to learn to defend that later on and to say that I chose to digress from your feedback because of these points. So, kind of learning to defend your stand is also important in that. But don't be afraid to also say, no, I'm sorry, I can't do that because it's not exactly what I want to do. Right.
I think that's probably the best advice I've heard all night, because at the end of the day, it is about the candidate defending their choices
Mhm.
and showing their maturity as a developing researcher. And sometimes we aren't going to agree with our supervisor. Sometimes we're going to get opinions that don't align with our worldviews, for example. And we have got to make that balance between, oh, I need to graduate, be good,
Yes.
right? And no, this is not what I set out to do. So I really do appreciate the honesty of that particular feedback, because quite often, I hear with people, I work with candidates who supervisor says, just do as you're told. And that's not a fair position for
Yeah.
some, and they're too scared to be able to stand up. So I do appreciate you saying that. Um, Very much I'd like to say thank you for our discussion tonight. We got quite a few more people in the audience as we were talking, which is fantastic. So in a moment, I'm going to open that up for questions from the audience. But before I do that, and you've just given the most wonderful piece of advice, but I'm going to ask you for one more piece of advice. What is the most valuable or the most meaningful advice you could give to a candidate going into their first annual review? Just person to person advice. What would that be?
I think I would just tell them to have fun. It's simple as that. You know,
Lovely.
have fun. It's not the end of the world if you're asked to make revisions, right? And you do expect that there will be revisions because that's part and parcel of research.
Yeah.
It's never a black and white thing. There's a lot of gray areas. But as long as you're having fun doing it, it makes those kind of revisions less painful, right?
I think we all suddenly want Professor Ramos as our supervisor because
well,
he's going to make it fun for us as well, even through the hard times.
yes.
Oh,